if you're familiar with the Strokes, the song "The Adults Are Talking," that was mixed by Ben Baptie. Now, I mentioned Ben in a recent video, but he's a guy who learned under Tom Elmhirst, and Tom is a guy who took home the most Grammys ever in one day. The same day he took home, I think, 5 or 6 Grammys or something for his mixes. So let's talk about what they're doing, because Ben learned from Tom, and a lot of the stuff they do is very similar. So something Ben was doing on the Strokes song, and he also did it on the song "A Beautiful Life" by Michael Kiwanuka. He's using a combination of a hybrid setup. It's both a little analog, a little in the box. So let me just kind of give you the rundown of the way his flow is, and then I'll show you the plugins that he's using, which I basically built his mix chain in plugins, so you guys can kind of see what that would be like. But basically what this guy's doing is he's coming out of Pro Tools into his Neve Genesis console. Now, on the Genesis, he's getting his basic balance. He might do some EQ, but something he made it a point to note was that he used to be very aggressive with EQ, especially things like too much low end on EQs on individual tracks. And he's since changed from that style because it was ruining his mixes. And what he now does is he likes the concept of doing more on his mix bus than he does on individual tracks, specifically on low end he was talking about. So I'm going to show you, he basically handles that with a curve bender on his mix bus. I'm going to show you what we're talking about here. All right, but he's taken all the tracks using antelope conversion into his Neve Genesis, pulling up all the faders, getting a good balance. Now, Tom Elmhirst, I'm going to kind of parallel back and forth between these guys, right? Tom, his thing is he needs to get himself excited about a mix. So whether you have just a control surface of some kind, like I got the UF8, that's my way of balancing things as quick as I can. I basically pull all the faders down, and then when I flip through the tracks and I try to bring things up in a way that gets me excited, I'm trying to do it as quick as possible before I get numb to the song, and within 20 minutes have something that's a reasonable balance before I touch a knob of EQ or compression or anything. Pulling up faders, getting the pan right. Now, that's what Tom does, and Tom's running around doing it on his console, getting his balances right immediately, as quick as possible, because he's going with his instinct. That's another big thing. He's trusting his instinct. Now, once the balance is up on his console for Ben and Tom, both of them, they basically then, everything on the console sums down to 2 channels in the console. That gets sent to their Mixbus chain. Now, they run a curve bender and a Manley Varimu. I love the way Ben Baptie explains his techniques and his process, but he never specifically says what order he uses. What's first? Is it the curve bender or is it the Varimu? If I had to guess, based on the way it's organized in his rack, it's probably curve bender first and then Manley Varimu, but he never once says. If anybody could find it and point it out to me in some place, that would be cool. But I listened with my ears wide freaking open, could not find him saying into. I hear him talking about the curve bender and then talking about the Manley Varimu. Sometimes he talks about the Varimu first and then mentions the curve bender. It's like, somebody spit out the order. This into this or the other way around. It matters. But let's go back to the point. This is really not about what this sounds like after it's been baked and then I'm going to rebake it with more stuff on it. I mean, by the time we're done, we got burnt cookies over here. So, but either way, we got a track. Now, the first thing, like I said, console sums out into his curve bender, I believe. Now, it's either his curve bender or his Varimu first, but he uses these 2 things. The curve bender, I believe, is first. He's boosting 50. That's really his thing. Like I said before, he doesn't like to do a lot of low-end boost, but he will boost and crank 50, 2 dB, 3 dB. This is a very musical style EQ. He's running this in stereo mode, not in mid-side. He's also boosting some 20K. All right, so just important to note these things because he wants the shine on top and he wants the low-end boost in the most musical way possible. So after he's got his curve bender, the Varimu. Now, he uses this in a very interesting way because he's using it in mid-side mode. So the stereo curve bender, which he's not using in mid-side, into a Manley Varimu, which he is. And the reason he does that is because he likes to basically control his sides separate from his mids in, the middle channel on a compressor. This way he could do different things, like limit the sides instead of compress them if he wants. But he's also not hitting this particularly hard, whereas Tom describes hitting this very hard. So it's like everybody works different. Tom is a guy who may crank into this a little bit harder than Ben, at least on that specific Stroke song, and on the Kiwanuka song. He didn't really hit it too hard. So what we're dealing with, right, just important things to know. When you run this in mid-side, the left side here is going to control the mids, and then the right side is going to control the sides. So you can basically move the threshold around to determine how much you're compressing on the sides, separate from the mids. Now, he mixes mid-heavy, which is why he likes this. Mid-heavy means you're putting a lot of stuff down the center, and as a result, he wants to make sure his sides can sort of breathe differently. And that's really why you would use mid-side. And I just don't think a lot of people talk about using compressors in mid-side mode that often. So I thought it was interesting and worth talking about. Experiment with the rest of the settings because it's not really critical what everything's set at. Any given song, I'm sure he's tweaking and changing things up. But I could also tell you that on the specific song for the Strokes, he was compressing like a quarter or half of a dB. Very little, and the needle was barely moving, if at all. So that's what I'm saying. Like, it was not a lot happening here. However, just engaging anything that is an analog type of, emulation of a piece of gear in a plugin, it's going to have a flavor and a sound. So, I was talking about this in a lesson I was given the other day. Just put something on like a Pultec and the sound changes. Put something on like API. The sound's going to change regardless of how much you do. So I just thought this was interesting. He's using this, and this is not one I typically use on the Mixbus, but he is. So I may start messing with it a little bit. I just like ideas, and this is a cool one. Control your sides separate from the mids. Now, let's deal, and when I say mids, I don't mean mid EQ, I mean the middle. All right, so now what else we got? After that, so he's running, this is bend now we're talking about. Curve bender into the Varimu. Now, back into Pro Tools, and he's got a few options. So in Pro Tools, he's got something we all like. What I noticed, by the way, if you're noticing there's an EQ one band here, what I noticed was when I put this on the track, was the Varimu lowers the volume on the UAD plugin pretty significantly, where I couldn't really match the volume before the plugin and after it, even when it was hardly compressing at all. The volume got significantly lower, and there was no way for me to make up that difference. So I added just some gain after on this EQ just to kind of get as close as I could to on and off to be able to tell the difference. To be able to judge it, you got to gain match. You got to basically match the volumes. Check out the next thing. He's got similar to, you'll notice a pattern of what people really like the more videos like this I do, because I've done Chad Blake, I've done Andrew Sheps, and now we're over here. I even did Tizio. So notice this. Even though he's cutting out some rumble that was on an 808 that was destroying things, he basically put it back, or not in the same way put it back, but he is boosting 50 on the curve bender. So I just find it interesting, right? A little boost at 50. He's still going to cut here things that are annoying him. So give and take, all right? As with everything in mixing. He found a couple other frequencies that hurt him. He pulled those out. Don't pay attention to where they are. It's not relevant. Concept is what's relevant. So he's doing this in mid-side also, keep in mind. Mid-side, so he's over here, he's got this, and he's doing a little bit of taking out some lows on the stereo channel, which is the sides in our case here, taking out the lows on the sides and boosting a bit of highs in a shelf. So low shelf happening, and then a little bit of a high shelf happening, bringing a little bit of air and life into his, guitars and different things like this, because this was on the Strokes song. This is a great plugin. It's one of my favorites. Also, bass shift was engaged very slightly on what he was doing also, which kind of just controls exactly where that hump of low end is. All right, let's move on. What else we got? So I have Spectre plugin on next, and I know he was using Ozone Trash. I don't use Ozone Trash, but the reason and why he was using it is key. Now, we could do this on several plugins, but the one that I like the most for it is Spectre, because this, to me, is actually the closest thing to the Tom Elmhirst, piece of gear that he owns by Crane song, which is the one I couldn't remember the name of, and I still can't. Come on, come to me. What is it? I don't know. It's still not there. But anyway, the coolest part is this is why this plugin is so great. If you haven't used it or seen it, you can choose. Do you want diode? Now, what is diode? Diode is like a tube saturation, but it basically gives you more highs. It's a tube saturation that focuses more on the highs. So in layman's terms, I like diode. I'm sure there's a better definition, but that's what it is. Whereas if you set it to tape, it's rolling off more highs. It's saturating and giving you that tape presence. And the cool thing about this plugin is you can control exactly where that happens. So in other words, you could put what Ben Baptie was doing was basically around 6K with a very wide type of shelf on Ozone Trash. He was, bringing up with a tape saturation, but every saturator sounds different. And I love saturation plugins because of that, because it's always like, ooh, what are we going to get this time? And you pull it up and you jack it up and you decide, hey, this is cool. And then you try a different one. It sounds completely different. And every saturation plugin sounds different, just like every saturation box is a little different. So diode, what I love is the choices here. You get to choose between. You want diode, you want tape, you want tube, you want warm, you want solid state, which is like no saturation. What do you want? The bit crush? You want the digital sound? I just love all my choices at my fingertips and the ability to dial it in only where I want. Now, this is boost only. This ain't no cuts, but it's just what Ben was doing, like I said, around 6K and up. Now, when you solo that, what's happening there when you saturate it? He's using the tape saturation setting, but what I found is that the diode setting on here, this plugin, is closer to that, because really what he was doing is literally this weird, like, the hissy part of the music was basically all that was there. That was what was coming up when he used the delta mode to just hear what that was, what he was adding. And man, did it bring life to stuff. So, just what life did it bring? Lots of it. So made me think. I was like, okay. We need some of that. So what I felt like was close to what that was I went somewhere around 6, with this one. And I widened the Q up. All right. I didn't want to bring it down too much, and then I put the tape saturation above it. So I'm actually combining two kind of saturations right here. And I was like, that's pretty cool. So it's adding so much life. It adds this life to the track because it's like, some shiny top end that doesn't sound brittle. It just sounds cool. So it's a really cool way to bring things to life. Anybody who doesn't know about saturating the high end, you're missing out. Diode focuses on the highs. That's what the difference is. Now, it's a tube type saturation that focuses on highs, whereas tape is its own flavor saturation that gives you a little less of the highs. So it depends what you want. And I'm obviously exaggerating this a little just to give, you could just add a little flavor of it. You need half a dB on a plugin like this. You could do this with other things. I have Studer A800 over here. Softtube has a plugin. What was it called? It's just saturation knob, and I think it's free. Yeah, this one right here. So now, the cool thing about this, if you like it, is you go up to keep high, and you'll get your high saturation when you crank this knob here. And then if you want kind of in the middle, you go here, neutral, and then that's pretty much just the low-end saturation. So you basically got different options for saturation. It's a free plugin. Check it out if you want a saturation plugin and you don't own one, and mess with the keep it high mode, because then you can get kind of what he's doing with Ozone Trash, which is basically this kind of a curve, starting around 6K, goes up. It's a nice shelf, and it's tape saturation on Ozone Trash. So I'm messing with diode because to me that sounds closest to what that was doing. After the Brainworks, after the Spectre, doing its thing, he had an L1 just preventing. He basically had the L1 just on as a safety, and that's where he capped his Mixbus chain technically. But then he had basically what he was going to consider his version of mastering. Now, he's basically taking these things off before going to mastering. So that's the part I want everyone to know is different about the way this guy works, is before he's sending to mastering, he's going to remove this thing he's putting on. So the L1 was barely doing anything. He just lowered the ceiling a little bit. Like that was it, right? But these are the other things that he would take off prior to mastering. The L3, if you're not familiar with an L3, It's basically a multi-band limiter, and I'm pretty sure it was the first one. The L3, which was shaving some transient off the snare, like just cutting down some snare hits by a couple dB. That was all it was doing, really. And after that, he had his L2. Now, his L2, I think he just had the Pro L. It was an older version, but all he was really doing was turning up the gain to jam it so it was the right level, as if it was a mastered song. He would take these off prior to mastering. Ben Baptie did mention he doesn't use multi-band limiting anymore on his Mixbus. He did mention that. So this was at a time when he did. The biggest, most important thing was, hearing Ben and Tom both come from a similar school talking about it's all about the emotion. The emotion you're trying to bring out of yourself when you're mixing is key. So in other words, you have to get mentally prepared to sit down and bring out the best in you every time you mix. And by working, like as Ben worked under Tom, he got to see somebody get themselves together to do their best work every day. And just witnessing that makes you realize you can do it too. Nobody just, comes to work half-ass and expects to get great performances done. I don't care if you're a guitarist playing on stage or you're mixing and there's nobody watching you. It's still a performance. And the quicker you can get things in a good position where you feel good, it sounds closer to where you like it than before, the quicker you do that, the better. So get your balances, get your panning, just work that. Then you can work a little more in detail. But Tom said something hilarious in one of the interviews I saw. Tom goes, when I was younger, like 20 years ago or whatever, he was saying, he's like, the first thing I would do is pull up the kick drum and EQ it. It's the worst possible move you could ever do. And he's made it a point to say, now I would do what took me hours and hours and hours back then. Now I would do in 20 minutes, because it doesn't matter what the EQ on the kick drum sounds like if it works in the song and it's all perfect. It doesn't matter, like nothing matters until you pull it up. You can't have any possible idea what you should do until it's up and in a position to where it's all balanced, sounding kind of good or not. Like get it there, then go to whatever you have to fix if there's something to be fixed, or just embellish the things you want to embellish if there's nothing to be fixed. I hope you guys liked the video. Leave something in the comments, questions, answers, anything you got. Throw it in there. I appreciate it. Hit the like button. Subscribe. Evan Jaffe Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.